Sri Aurobindo is leading us into a deeper study of the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, in which the power that creates the universe is described in the form of a horse, a power which brings into manifestation the universe, which sees what it wants to create, breathes into it life, gives it stable form, and itself permeates all that is manifested with a tremendous energy, speed, power, and enjoyment of the whole manifestation. Such is this image of the cosmic horse. In the second verse, we have come to the portion where the Upanishad describes how this horse bears up the four grades of beings in the cosmos, carries them as if on its back to extend the image of the horse, and describes four names which are the form of the horse when it carries each of these beings. In Sri Aurobindo's translation, he became higher and bore the gods, Vaja and bore the Gandharvas, Arvan and bore the Titans, Ashva and bore mankind. We read the paragraph where Sri Aurobindo explains this, that the sage throws out briefly a description, not exhaustive but typical, of the relations of the horse to the different natural types of being that seem to possess this universe. For all of them, he is the Vahana. He bears them up on his infinite strength and speed and motion. He bears all of them without respect of difference, samabhavena, with the divine impartiality and equality of soul. Samam hi Brahma. To the type of each individual being, this universal might adapts itself. He seems to take upon himself their image. He is higher to the gods, Arvan to the Asura, Vajin to the Gandharvas, Ashva to men. We read this portion and we also explored the implications, but we review it now with a still deeper insight. Sri Aurobindo now quotes from the Bhagavad Gita, Ye yatha mam prapadyante tams tathaiva bhajamyaham mama vartmanu vartante manushyaha partha sarvashah. Literally translated, as people approach me, in the same way I respond to them. They all follow my path in every possible way. This would be a brief literal translation. And Sri Aurobindo says, in continuation of this idea, in reality, they are made of his image, not he in theirs. And though he seems to obey them and follow their needs and impulses, though they handle the whip, ply the spur and tug the reins, it is he who bears them on in the courses of time that are marked out for him by his hidden self. He is free and exults in the swiftness of his galloping. We had read this and we went into it in some detail. But as with all the texts of the Upanishads and Sri Aurobindo's writings equally, there are many layers and layers of insight and implication. And we go a little further now into two very important insights that emerge from this. In Sri Aurobindo's own commentary, he first describes the horse as carrying these forms, these beings on his back. Then, after quoting this verse from the Gita, he reverses the relationship and says, in reality, they are made in his image. And though they handle the whip, the spur, and the reins, it is he who bears them on. This double relationship is extremely important in the way the universe functions. In the initial movement of the manifestation, we find right at the beginning, the very foundations of this whole creation are in the principle of freedom. And so everything that is thrown out in multiplicity of creation is free. They have even the freedom to turn against the divine will. And this is how the mother narrates the first asuras are born. They are, in the Vedic terminology, the elder gods, because they appeared even before the gods came. And then, as if to undo this anti-divine movement that has been possible in the freedom, the second manifestation of the gods emerges, who do not have the same freedom. They are not so much part of the play of the universe as they are its rescuers, as they are its guides. And we find already this great conflict between fate and free will. On the one hand, we experience the free will. On the other hand, we find, in spite of our free will, certain things are as if compelled upon us. Even at times it appears that the free will is only an illusion. It is only a greater fate which we do not see, which compels our own sense of free will. And the conflict goes on. When the matter is approached intellectually, there seems to be no resolution. Amal Kiran, a man of a great intellect, having read all that Sri Aurobindo had to say about fate and free will, finally went to the mother and said, "Mother, I have read everything, I have understood all the arguments, but I still don't understand. Is there free will? Just tell me yes or no." And mother simply said, "Yes." But it is because of an intellectual pursuit that we find the two so deeply, intricately interwoven that we cannot separate one from the other. In the very working of fate, there is the free will, and in the expression of free will, there seems to be an underlying fate, and you cannot seem to separate them. In another fascinating discussion in one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo says, at the lowest level in the cosmos, that is in matter, there seems to be a compelling destiny. Matter, material processes are as if bound by the iron law. We call those laws laws of physics. But if you push something, it keeps moving, following specific laws, and is entirely as if predictable. This is at the lowest level. And at the highest level, again, Sri Aurobindo says, there is as if an absolute fate. That is, what the divine chooses freely is fate. And there is no scope for confusion or variation because it is his free choice and there is none other than him. In between is the play of the flexibility of the free will and so on. But here in this passage, although these words of fate and free will are not explicitly stated, there is a profound revelation of the nature of these two, of fate and free will. First of all, this tremendous power which forms the cosmos is seen to be carrying on his back all these beings. The focus is not of matter, of plants, or of animals, but conscious beings. Although the same power creates everything, including matter and plants and animals, it is to conscious beings that the text refers to, beginning with the human beings at the lowest level, above them the titans, above them the Gandharvas, and above them the gods. And all these conscious, self-aware, self-conscious beings who have a freedom innately and are conscious of their own freedom are carried by the horse. But in this relationship, the rider of the horse, as if, controls the direction of where the horse goes. So he says, they handle the whip, ply the spur, and tug the reins. Now Sri Aurobindo takes trouble to explicitly state these three because these have obvious implications in the symbol. We are carried by this cosmic energy. We may say our life, our time sense, our purpose or our destiny, whatever name we give to it, we choose it. So first, with the whip, we try to compel the chaotic tendency of the energy of the world, the horse, to wander here and there. By the whip, we try to force circumstances into the line that we choose, to try to compel fate to go in the direction that we want. Second tool which we have, the spur. Sitting on the horse, we squeeze with our legs with a sharp point to provoke the horse to go faster. We see that this is the direction in which we want to go, having brought all the elements of our life in line with the whip in that direction. We now try to speed up the direction of our destiny to get there faster. If it's going to take 10 years, I want to get there in a single year. And this is the second power which we have, to speed up the process by a certain concentration, by a bringing together, by an intensifying of the energy. And the third power which we have, when in spite of our best efforts, we find ourselves ending up in the wrong direction, we pull the reins of the horse. And the reins are as if fixed on the mouth of the horse. And there, as we pull the reins, the horse is compelled to slow down or even to stop. So these are the three powers by which we try to navigate life and seek to realize our own fate. But it feels as if we have a free will and we can choose by these three powers where we go, how fast we go, and even to change the direction of our journey. But then Sri Aurobindo says, in reality, they follow, though he seems to obey them and follow their needs and impulses, though they handle the whip, ply the spur, and tug the reins, it is he who bears them on in the courses of time that are marked out for him by his hidden self. He is free and exults in the swiftness of his galloping. So in reality, although we have this sense of freedom and ability to form our fate, it is he who is leading us on the courses that are marked out for him by his hidden self. We are merely carried along. And so this is the other side of the relationship of fate and free will. We find ourselves compelled by a greater fate in spite of all our efforts. We see this occasionally when circumstances just fall into place as if magically. And all our efforts which went to prevent something end up helping that thing to happen. Or all the efforts which went to making something happen end up preventing it, and something else altogether happens. And we are surprised. There was as if some underlying energy which chose its own purpose, its own outcome, and compelled it on us, in spite of our experience of free will. And the transition point from horse carrying us to we being led by the horse is this linking statement of the Bhagavad Gita, where also we find the same dual relationship. In the first line of the verse, as people approach me, so I respond to them. We see that the power is in the hands of people. We choose how to approach him, and he responds accordingly. But in the second line, he reverses the relationship. Along my path, they end up walking, all the people, in every possible way. Mama vartmanu vartante, mama vartma, my path, they end up compelled as if to follow. Manushya, all people, sarvasha, in every possible way. And what this is saying is, everything we do ends up following his lead, following his path which he has set for us. So there's this very interesting double relationship. On the one hand, we choose to approach him in whatever way we can, whatever way our natural temperament is, he responds accordingly. But on the other hand, we end up following only the way that he has set for us in every possible way. And this double relationship can be approached now on two levels. One, which is a very practical, superficial form of the relationship, and then we will see something still deeper. So first, in the practical, superficial form, we may say, how do we choose? Within our brains are these movements of electricity. Within our body are these arrangements of molecules. And what are these molecules made of? They are made of his energy. So what the cosmic rhythm chooses to express forms itself into the molecules of our body and our brain. And by extension, we may say our life energy is only a fragment of the universal life force. Our mind and its thinking is only a part, an island in the ocean of the universal mind. And so we are helplessly carried along in our physical energies, life energies, and mental energies by the universal movement of the energy. And so we really are helpless in every tiniest detail. All our sense of freedom is only an appearance, a superficial pretense. Even the sense of freedom is cast out by him in us. And we think we are free because he chooses that we should feel ourselves free. And this is the great illusion of freedom. And so this is the obvious starting point, most superficially seen. But there is a deeper truth behind all this, and that is, as we are a part of him in all these details of our energy, and as he is free, we too, as a part of him, are partially free. To the extent that we are a part of him, to that extent we share in his freedom in part. And therefore, within each one of us is also the seed of freedom, which is his freedom that we are part of, that we are sharing in. And in a sense, as we choose from our true seed of freedom, that free choice that we make is his free choice also. So there is a way of looking at it where the freedom exists, which is his, but which is also ours. And there is at the same time this huge, humongous machinery of which we are a part, where we are compelled by his choice. And yet we share in his freedom and can modify and choose our destiny. And when we choose it, it is not in opposition to him. Being a part of him, it is as if his choice that we have chosen, although we had a freedom. So when we look at it in a more intuitive manner, we do not see the two in any way in conflict. Destiny is his free choice. We, sharing in his freedom, can also choose in our deeper freedom the destiny of us individually, which is part of the larger destiny of the cosmos. And there's a relationship between the two. And the two, fate and free will, are not so radically opposite to each other. They are even two faces of a single movement. And it is this suggestion which is being highlighted by showing us these two sides of the relationship. We are asked not merely to look at, oh, the rider leads the horse, or the horse leads the rider, but to experience this deeper truth of which both are facets. And you'll see in the formulation, Sri Aurobindo leads us to this when he says, in reality they are made in his image and not he in theirs, though he seems to obey them and follow their needs and impulses. And in the courses of time that are marked out for him by his hidden self, he is free and exults in the swiftness of his galloping. So the whole cosmos is an outburst of a divine freedom, of which we are a part. To the extent that we align ourselves with our essence, where we are one with the freedom of the cosmos, of the origin, we share in his freedom. To the extent that we lose ourselves in the forms of the movement, we are as if victims of circumstances. So in these conscious beings, the four gradations of beings, is this very interesting mix of fate and free will which appear to be separated, but in the origin they are two facets of a single truth. I'm tempted to digress with a few mundane examples, but they will help to highlight this truth. There is a series of experiments which are being conducted to determine to what extent we are truly free. And these experiments all settle on observing the brain and its processes. So we wire up the brain, observe the rhythms of the brain, and the person is then asked to make a choice. Either choose an object on the left or an object on the right. And at the moment when he makes the choice in his freedom, he is supposed to indicate by pushing a button that he has made a choice. And what is observed is, looking at the brain, when a person chooses now, I make a choice to turn left, the scientist has already seen in the brain waves that he is going to choose the left side. 1/3 of a second before he makes the actual choice or thinks he has made the choice. So observing the brain, I can say, oh, now he will turn right. And 1/3 of a second later, he says, now I choose freely to turn right. The conclusion the scientists made, of course, was that actually we do not have free will. That our sense of free choice is itself the outcome of a process which could be seen in the brain 1/3 of a second before. But there are other experiments which seem to show the very opposite truth. And this is explained very simply by recognizing that our mind, our self-awareness has many layers. And well before we come to the self-aware choice, a choice is made at a subliminal level of which this self-aware choice is a reflection. And when that choice is made on the subliminal level, it is registered in the brain already. From there it emerges to the surface. And if you observe how you make a choice, whether left or right, and I want you to make a random choice, you'll find you hesitate, and then suddenly something comes forward which chooses. If you observe, it came forward from somewhere inside. And by a process of introspection, you can actually trace it back to a deep level within you, almost subliminal or perhaps even completely subliminal, from where the real choice is made. If we become conscious of that point, then we will be aware when we actually made the choice rather than becoming aware when the choice emerged in our awareness. That's the difference. So these are experiments which reveal deeper insights into the nature of this freedom, free will. There's another interesting aside, quite mundane but amusing, which is explored in this relationship. In a recent movie which is titled Robocop 4, if you're interested to see it, it is a human being, a human brain which is fixed into a machine, and the robot machine is led now by the human brain, and there's a fine balance between whether machine controls the brain or the brain controls the machine. And they show in this film that always when the brain controls the machine, we are too slow. Fighting against a robot, the robot takes quick decisions, whereas the human being hesitates and then takes a decision. So he's always lagging behind. And then somewhere along the way in the movie, they rewire the machinery, and they find this man now is able to go as fast as the robot. And the conversation now ensues between two people, and they ask, how is it now he is able to go so fast? And the scientist says, I rewired his brain so that the machine takes the decision but presents it to the brain as if it is the brain's choice. And he says, classic example of the illusion of freedom. So I thought it amusing because we really do not know who decides for us. Whether we are led by some secret fate that masquerades as a free will, or whether we have true free will. We could just be carried by this machine. But this whole issue of fate, free will, and the nature of free will, who carries us, who leads our destiny, is dealt with in just the suggestion that the horse carries these self-conscious beings. And Sri Aurobindo opens out the discussion by showing the two sides, and in particular putting this linking statement of the Bhagavad Gita, showing the two facets simultaneously. In the way it is formulated in the Gita, it is quite obvious and very simply explained. When the Lord says that it is my path that people follow in every possible way, the truth is simply this: He is seated within us. What He chooses in His absolute freedom unfolds in us as our choice and leads us towards our destiny. Everything we do ultimately resolves back to His choice. So He carries us. And although we have the illusion of controlling Him with the whip and the spur and the reins, the three powers by which we try to realize our destiny, even that control is really an expression of His free will. So with this we conclude the discussion on the four beings and the relationship with the horse. And now Sri Aurobindo moves to why these four beings, what do they represent, and why is the horse given four different names depending on which being he carries. So obviously, according to the grade of the being is the quality of the energy which carries that being, and the names are a symbol of that quality. So this is what Sri Aurobindo points to in a discussion which spans 3.5 pages. And this is quite unusual, when in the earlier portions he has been extremely concise, although opening so many different dimensions in the discussion, very concisely throwing suggestions and hints. But here over 3.5 pages he elaborates and explains why he is elaborating. Because he says he wants to show the way the ancient Vedantins thought, how they used words and the way the symbols were formed. And this is the reason why it will allow us to as if slide into the mindset of the ancients and see things from their viewpoint, and in particular reveal the nature of the power of the word. So in this he begins with, but what are these names? Haya, Vajin, Arvan, Ashva. Certainly, they must suggest qualities which fit the horse in each case to the peculiar type of its rider. But the meaning depends on associations and an etymology which in modern Sanskrit has gone below the surface and are no longer easily seizable. We had a discussion once on the deeper meaning of the Vedas in some conference, and people had come up with some deeper insights and revelations from analyzing the etymology of certain words. And then a very senior professor came to the stage and said, "Who are we to question the ancient commentators on the Veda? When they commented on the Veda 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, they were closer to the Veda than we are today. And so their understanding should be more accurate than ours. And we should simply follow them and not question them." This, unfortunately, has been the attitude in those who have approached the Veda and the Upanishads, which can easily be dated to at least 7,000 or more years. But Sri Aurobindo points out that when they made their commentaries 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, they had already lost the secret and were trying to recover. And whatever understanding they had lost the mindset of the Vedic rishis and were making first attempts to recover something which was lost. And therefore, we are well justified in making a different attempt if we can from a deeper insight. And this is the effort Sri Aurobindo makes in his commentaries on the secret of the Veda and these texts on the Upanishads. It is also important to note that in the later years, the last 2 decades, Sri Aurobindo wrote, of course, his letters, correspondence in response to questions from disciples, but he wrote a few sonnets, significant portions of the text that is now known as Savitri. And at the same time that he was writing Savitri, he was translating the verses from the Veda, which appears as the book called Hymns to the Mystic Fire. At the same time, Savitri on one side and Hymns to the Mystic Fire on the other side. It is as if on the one side it was his Vedic composition in English language, on the other side as if translating into English the rhythm and the power of the Vedic articulation simultaneously. And it was during this period that the mother noted, while he would be sitting there translating the hymns to the mystic fire, Agni himself would be present in front of Sri Aurobindo during the time that he wrote. So the importance that Sri Aurobindo gave to the recovery of that mindset of the Vedic rishis, an intuitive mind that was seeing directly the spiritual truth, the importance he gave to that is tremendous. And he points out in his writings that the fact that humanity is able to recover the intellectual power so quickly, within a few generations even, is possible because this power of the intellect had already been developed in a previous cycle. But this power could not then make the transition to a higher level because something was missing. And therefore there had to be a fall from that higher intuitive consciousness, a fall back to the intellect and even to a sub-intellectual level, infra-rational level, in order to complete that which was missing, in order to link that higher possibility with the lower, and then another ascent to be made, where rapidly we have recovered the intellectual power and have now to move to something still higher. And it is through these texts and through this kind of a meditation on the Vedic and Upanishadic form that he helps the human mind to an intuitive way of seeing and expressing. And that's why this discussion is so important. It reveals to us the way the ancients formulated their intuitive sight in the etymology and in the words. But this old association of the and etymology is lost to modern Sanskrit, has gone below the surface and no longer easily seizable. And yet it can be seized, and he will do that. Haya is especially difficult. For this reason, Shankara, relying too much on scholarship and intellectual inference and too little on his intuitions, is openly at a loss in this passage. Sri Aurobindo read the commentary of Shankara and pointed out also its limitations. And when he had to point out the limitations, precisely because there would be those who would say, how do you know? Because he was closer to the Veda, he should be more accurate. So he gives you the logical reasons why Shankara's explanation fails, and then offers you with the same clarity of logic that deeper insight. So in Shankara's approach, because it was the period when humanity was turning once again to reinforcing the rational intellectual mind, there was a tendency to rely more on scholarship and intellectual inference. Intuition was still respected, but was not the primary means. He sees that the word haya for horse must arise from the radical sense of motion born by the root he. But every horse has motion for his chief characteristic and utility. Arvan and Vajin, no less than haya. Why then should haya alone be suitable for riding by the gods? Why Arvan for the asuras? He has, I think, the right intuition when he suggests that it is some peculiar and excelling kind of motion, Vishishta Gati, which is the characteristic of haya. So, Shankara comes close to that but stops short. That haya, because it comes from the root he, means motion, but some special motion, we do not know what exactly. But then, unable to fix on that peculiarity, unable to read any characteristic meaning in the names that follow, he draws back from his intuition and adds that after all, these names may have merely indicated particular kinds of horses attributed mythologically to these various families of riders. But this suggestion would make the passage mere mythology. But the Upanishads, always intent on their deeper object, never waste time over mere mythology. We must therefore go deeper than Shankara and follow out the intuition he himself has abandoned. Not that he didn't have intuition, but you follow intuition up to a point. When you're not sure, you stop and use your logic. This is how we work in the modern mind also. So straight away, in these texts of the ancient Upanishads and the Vedas, there is nowhere mere mythology. There is always a deeper truth, and we must keep that in mind. And now he explains why he is taking so much time over this passage. I am dwelling on this passage at a length disproportionate to its immediate importance, not only because Shankara's failure in handling it shows the necessity and fruitfulness of trusting our intuitions when in contact with the Upanishads, but because the passage serves two other important uses. So the first is the importance in trusting intuition. And you go back to the initial passage of this commentary where Sri Aurobindo reminded us of the method of Vedic knowledge to listen in soul to the old voices and allow the Shruti in the soul to respond, to vibrate, first obscurely in answer to the Vedantic hymn of knowledge, to give the response, the echo, and last to let that response gain in clarity, intensity, and fullness. So this is the method that we have to follow. And for that we have to trust the intuition. But there are two other important uses. It illustrates the Vedantic use of the etymology of words, and it throws light on the precise notions of the old thinkers about those super-terrestrial beings with whom the vision of the ancient Hindus peopled the universe. The Vedantic writers, we continually find, dwelt deeply and curiously on the innate and on the concealed meaning of words. So every word, every sound has an innate meaning. Even if you don't know, the sound tells you what it carries. You don't need a dictionary. The sound itself is a carrier of a certain vibration. So that's the innate meaning. And then there is a concealed meaning. The innate meaning may be more obvious in sensory experience, but the concealed meaning reveals the spiritual principle or truth behind the sensory experience. For example, when we experience sensorily light, the physical experience of light is an illumination which reveals what is. The light goes away and everything falls back into darkness. But exactly the same thing takes place in our mind, in our thoughts. When the understanding dawns on us, we say, the light spreading, the understanding reveals itself. Or we say, my mind is clouded and there is a dulling of the perception, and as if the thing fades out and you do not understand anymore as you begin to fall asleep. So there is exactly the same process taking place in the mind's illumination, in the mind's understanding. And in fact, there is a third level on which the same thing takes place, which is a spiritual experience. When the spiritual comes upon us, when the spiritual experience comes upon us, the presence is felt, the consciousness opens out to wideness. We become aware of what was already present within us. When it retires, it is as if that deeper reality is covered up and we are once again thrown in our surface consciousness. The spiritual light reveals a spiritual reality and we experience it. When that light fades, then we fall out of the experience and the experience is lost. But all three experiences are exactly the same thing. Light revealing or light withdrawing and therefore concealment. So Sri Aurobindo points out that in fact the physical experience of light is a reflection of the spiritual experience of light. And so each sound and any combination of sound therefore has an innate meaning which we may access in sensory terms, but it has a hidden meaning which represents these higher realities. The Vedic tradition speaks of three levels of meaning of the Veda. Adhibhautik, which is the immediate, material, obvious sensory explanation. Adhidaivik, which is the psychological understanding of the same thing on a higher level. And Adhyatmik, which is the original, essential, spiritual truth which is hidden behind. The same way as we experience light on three levels, so the power of the sound is experienced on these three levels: Adibhautik, Adidaivik, Adhyatmik. So it is to these that Sri Aurobindo is referring when he speaks of the Vedantic writers. We continuously find dwelt deeply and curiously on the innate and on the concealed meaning of words. And this naturally allowed for what is referred to as the twilight language. You speak something, it has an obvious meaning, but then it has also a secret meaning behind, which is not so obvious. Vyakarana, always considered essential to the interpretation of the Vedas. They used not merely as scholars, but much more as intuitive thinkers. So Vyakarana is this etymology. To Vedic interpretation it is essential, but it can be used in a scholarly way or it can be used in an intuitive way. It was not only the actual etymological sense or the actual sense in use, but the suggestions of the sound and syllables of the words which attracted them. For they found that by dwelling on them, new and deep truths arose into their understandings. Let us see how they use this method in assigning the names assumed by the sacrificial horse. And then follows 2.5 pages of discussion. But here, we are again reminded of this double meaning. First, there's an actual etymological sense or the actual sense in use, and the other is suggestions of the sound and syllables of the words. And it is this suggestion which attracted them, because by dwelling on them, new and deep truths arose into their understanding. We have at various times, even in this study, touched upon some examples of that. How going into the etymology gives us a deeper meaning of what the words carry. We did this also with our study of the Isha Upanishad. But in principle, what is often done is every word, especially words used in the yogic experiences, can be taken for their deeper meaning, and we find some deep insight, philosophical, spiritual truths behind the way that word is structured. This is true to some extent in every language, but it is more true in the languages which are closer to the original language, where sound and form of sound were connected or identical even. Of the surviving modern languages, this is most easily seen in Sanskrit. It is also seen in some of the old languages, to some extent in Greek, in Latin. But it is seen much more effectively among Western languages in Hebrew. And you will find among the traditions in the Hebrew tradition, especially in the Kabbalah, this use of sounds as symbols, significant symbols of spiritual truths. And that is the reason why even today, most of Western magic continues to rely on the sounds of the Hebrew language and the symbols from the Kabbalah. In the East, of course, it is Sanskrit which is the representative language, although modern Sanskrit, Sri Aurobindo says, has already been distanced from its origins, which is in the Vedic Sanskrit. I'm tempted to keep the subsequent discussion for later and simply dwell on a few examples of how fluid the language can be when it is close to its origin. There's a very interesting text which has been prepared by Dr. Sampadananda Mishra of the Sri Aurobindo Society, titled The Wonder That is Sanskrit. And you will find it fascinating to see how the flexibility of the language can express itself in such amazing ways. There is a very famous verse which, when read forward, is a prayer to Vishnu, and when read backward is a prayer to Shiva. And each letter of this verse can be converted into its equivalent number according to its position in the alphabet, and you get the ratio of the circle circumference to its diameter, pi. Pi to the 32nd decimal place. So 3 things are embedded in it at the same time. Forward it is a prayer to Vishnu, backward a prayer to Shiva, and reduced to numbers, it is a unique, special, transcendental number which is deeply rooted in all of nature's processes. Something like that is very difficult to create in the more modern languages, where already the connection with the root is broken and words represent ideas in their sum, but the root sounds and root meanings have been as if forgotten or lost. It is still possible but very difficult, whereas in those languages it is possible with much greater ease. Another example which is referred to in that text is of a verse which was spontaneously composed by a South Indian saint, which consists of 64 syllables that you can arrange on the chessboard, 1 syllable on each square. And the whole thing read is one prayer. But then if you put the horse on the chessboard at the top left corner and make it jump continuously so that it covers all the chess squares without ever repeating itself, and you follow the sequence of the horse, you end up with a completely different verse at the same time, with a different meaning altogether. And at the same time you have solved the puzzle of the horse, how to move a horse across the chessboard without ever repeating a square, which is a great mathematical puzzle which kept Europe occupied for 2 centuries. And here is a saint who spontaneously composes a verse in Sanskrit which solves the problem of the horse and has this 2 levels of meaning on such a complex level of arrangement. How is this even possible? And we can say either an extraordinary intellectual genius rivaling that of computers, or we say it is a power, a faculty above the intellect which sees and then casts into form what it sees directly, an intuitive power of genius. But the language is flexible enough to allow for something like this. Similarly, there are other references of some Jain texts where, as a training to heighten the power of the intellect and then to exceed the intellect, to transcend into a direct seeing, an intuitive perception, they would use some of these exercises which seem to us like intellectual gymnastics but involved actually a seeing above intellect and then a formulation in intellect. So among Jain texts there are many such interesting play of words, and in one particular case there is an entire paragraph which narrates the story of a saint when it's read normally. But then if the words are separately broken in a different way, you end up with a different story of another saint. And then if you keep the same words in the same sequence but break up in a different way, you get a third story of another saint. So 3 stories simultaneously spoken in a single paragraph of text. Depending on how you pause between the words, you are narrating a different story. And he refers to one particular text which is said to carry 24 stories in a single paragraph. And even for people with a normal intellect to decode each of the stories is a great challenge. How such a thing could ever be composed, one wonders. And you get the glimpse here that it was a very different way of thinking, a different way of the mind's working, which lived in the intuition, saw in directness, experienced and held knowledge in multiple facets in a single experience and vision, and then could translate that experience vision using a language that was flexible enough, but to give it form that communicated that multiplicity of experience in a single form. And then only it was considered to be a great achievement, because it expressed the inexpressible, the formless in form. And the formless is not blank, it is this multiplicity, rich experience, and that was formulated in a frozen, rigid form. And this they would consider a great achievement and even a spiritual experience. So it is not only the actual etymological sense or the actual sense in use, but the suggestions of the sound and syllables of the words which attracted them. For they found that by dwelling on them, new and deep truths arose into their understandings. And this is possible because when an experience thus is articulated by the intuition, even if the creator, the articulator, does not seek to bring out all these multiple meanings, the intuition carries them through. And this is the reason why we are advised to dwell on those verses and draw out their meanings layer by layer, facet by facet, suggestions and hints, each pushing you in a different line, a different thread of exploration, but all woven together and bound in a single formulation which captures it all. And as we dwell on it, our own consciousness is as if released from the limitation of form into the experience of the consciousness which can hold them all simultaneously as multiple facets of a single being, a single state of consciousness, a single experience. So we can read the second verse in its fullness and meditate on it briefly. Day was the grandeur that was born before the horse as he galloped. The eastern ocean gave it birth. Night was the grandeur that was born behind him, and its birth was from the other waters. These are the grandeurs that came into being on either side of the horse. He became higher and bore the gods, Vaja and bore the Gandharvas, Arvan and bore the Titans, Ashva and bore mankind. The sea was his brother, and the sea was his birthplace.